Today we're going to be talking about assessments and critiques, which are very important to flight training and any kind of training or instruction in general. We're going to be talking about the purpose of an assessment, the elements of assessments, and different kinds of ways that you are able to assess a student effectively. Firstly, the purpose of an assessment is to allow both the student and the instructor to know how the student is progressing, and it's going to give a sense of practical and specific feedback that the student and the instructor both can use in order to make the student better. And this is going to put out a clear-cut objective of how the student is able to raise their level of performance for the next lesson. General characteristics of an assessment: it's going to be objective, flexible, acceptable, comprehensive, constructive, and organized, just to name a few. So when you're talking about being objective, you want to make sure that no personal views of the instructor or student are going to affect how you're assessing the situation that has happened. Um, just keep a clear mind, and regardless of your feelings for the student or the student's feelings for the instructor, it needs to be fair for everyone. And then it needs to be flexible, so you need to allow for variables. Not everybody is exactly the same. Not everybody can be assessed the same. And it needs to be acceptable. Um, you have to, the student has to be able to accept the instructor and feel that they are proficient and that they know what they're talking about. They need to have confidence in their instructor, or their feedback is really not going to be very helpful at all, because they don't have the confidence the instructor even knows what they're talking about. And you need to be comprehensive, so you need to not just cover what went wrong in any sort of assessment. You need to make sure that you're going over things that went right as well. And you need to be constructive. So whenever you're assessing somebody or critiquing them, it's completely useless if there's nobody benefiting from it. And the person that needs to benefit from an assessment the most is the person who is training, so the student. So you want to make sure that on the flip side of that, you're also not praising your student just to kind of check the box to be praising for praise's sake. You want to make sure that you are praising the student when it is due and when it's needed, but students can tell when you're not being authentic when you're praising them. You need to be organized in your assessment, so really any sort of pattern that you're using to assess your students is going to be acceptable as long as there's some logic behind your pattern that you're using. And you need to be thoughtful. You need to respect how that student feels and take into account that their needs as a human being, like we've discussed previously, are going to weigh into how they're accepting this assessment. You need to be specific, so there should be no foggy or gray areas between exactly what you're assessing and what your recommendations are to make the student better in this instance. So just make sure you're very specific with your critiques and assessments. Um, Traditional assessments, there's these different types. So you've got written tests, and with written tests, you want to have characteristics of them being valid and reliable. So once reliable, you need to make sure that it gives you an accurate measurement of a certain group of people that you're wanting to test. So just consistency is key with reliability. It's almost a synonym. Validity. So you want to make sure that any test that you're giving is measuring what you want it to measure. And you need to. It's kind of like being specific for giving a test. You don't want to just be putting random things on there. And usability. So the functionality of your test. How hard is it to understand what you're asking? Are the answers clear? That's going to refer to your usability of a test. And then your objectivity. So this is going to be the singleness of how you're scoring the test. So theoretically, you would want any given instructor to be able to score a test, and then all the same results are going to apply. Um, Things that lead to a good objective test, you're going to have things like true or false questions or multiple choice, things that really it's just right or it's wrong. There's no in between, where a right in test would be left to the discretion of the instructor or the person that's grading it. Comprehensiveness, you want to kind of make sure that what you're testing for is the total picture of what you've been going over. Kind of goes back to validity in this case. And then another way is using discrimination, which this is a tactic that's going to let you distinguish between different students via test. Um, that's how discrimination works. So, authentic assessments. This is going to refer to like a practical test when you're assessing someone's real world skills and, and how they're demonstrating these skills. And then you've got collaborative assessments, which one element of that is going to be the replay element, where you're going to have the student go back and try to explain what happened, and you're going to see if your perceptions as an instructor differ from the student's perceptions, and you want to make sure that those things are the same. Reconstructing is where you're going to have the student go back and say, all right, what could have been, what should have done, what would have been done differently, and how could you have done that? That particular flight maneuver, for example. And then you're going to have reflecting. So you're going to ask the student, what part of this lesson was easier for you, what part of it was harder for you, things like that. And another element of that is redirecting. What did you learn in this lesson that you could apply to another one? Things like that you would be redirecting. Another way is an oral assessment. So with an oral assessment, that's just going to be direct or indirect questioning. You can have feeder questions or leading questions, but a lot of times you just want to be clear and ask exactly what you want to know. You want to use this to make sure that your student is retaining, and you kind of want to just check to see what your student is retaining via oral question. A characteristic of an effective question, like I was saying, you want it to be brief and concise and extremely clear and definite. There shouldn't be gray areas with your questioning if you want it to be effective. And let's talk about some different kinds of questions that you want to avoid. So you don't want to be puzzling, like putting this crazy scenario out there and, for example, what's the first action you would take if you're in a conventional gear airplane, weak right brake, steering left into a crosswind, you got a full flap, and you're doing a power on wheel landing. What do you do? Things like that should be avoided. It's too complicated. It's trying to trap the student into answering wrong. And then you don't want to oversize the question and really be talking about things that the student probably doesn't know about or wouldn't really even be expected to know about. You don't want to give toss-up questions like, for example, you just had an emergency. Are you going to pick the best field to land in, or are you going to squawk 7700? You don't want to put them in situations like that where, answer would really just be both and other things added on to that. So you really shouldn't give ultimatums in situations like that. And then bewilderment, where you're just really going way off in the left field with questions, trick questions, and then just irrelevant questions. If it has nothing to do with what you were talking about or how you were training, then it should be avoided. There's different kinds of critiques. So you've got instructor and student critiques. In this case, you want it to be organized, and you don't need it to allow it to generate into like a free-for-all, just random questions everywhere. It needs to be focused. And then you've got student-led critiques where you're going to let the student lead the assessment and let the student kind of critique themselves. Another way is small group critiques, where you would have more of like a classroom setting in this case, and you may have small groups of students in the class critique other groups or even individuals. And then you've got individual student critiques by other students. So let's say that you were working with two students, you could have each of those students critique each other and see what they've noticed. Self-critiques, which are very important, you want to do that with everything, is kind of just evaluate what you did and how you did it. Written critiques, these are really useful to be able to use in the future to look back on things that you need to go over. So as an instructor, I could write critiques about a flight lesson and then give it to a student, and that student can take those critiques and look at them later instead of having to remember in that instance what went wrong or what went good. And these are the different types of assessments and critiques.